Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Sean couldn't be here today, but I have my beautiful girlfriend Allison going to help me out today film this job for you. And what the job is we're going to replace automatic transmission shifter bushings and the transfer case shifter seat on a third generation Toyota 4runner. So Sean, being the cool guy that he is, and he's always going to the pick and pulls in San Jose where we live, he got me a nice little prop here. So this is the shifter assembly for the automatic transmission model on third gen 4runners. Now the bushings I'm talking about are right in this area. There's a long bolt that goes through with a bushing on either side. This side you can't really see because we have this mechanism in the way. But basically on both sides of this rod, there's a nylon bushing on either side. The other two bushings are going to be for this part of the shifter arm. If you lift up this boot, you can see a bolt that's going through. And again, there's a nylon bushing on either side that will allow this to shift smoothly and have less play. Now the reason why you might want to decide to do this is because you got a lot of slop side to side, not front to back. That's the shifter linkage with the transmission moving a little bit. We're talking about side to side, driver door to passenger door. If you grab your shifter and you can feel a lot of slop left to right, that means your shifter bushings are wasted. And if you get tired of having a sloppy shifter, you'll do the job we're going to show you how to do today. The other thing that we're going to replace is that shifter seat for the transfer case. And from experience, from doing a transmission swap with Sean, from doing a clutch replacement with our buddy Dan who lives over in the Tahoe area, we know that those shifter seats degrade over time and they get really brittle and they fall apart. So to kill two birds with one stone, knowing that I'm going to have to get this thing out to do the shifter bushings, I'm just going to go ahead and replace the shifter seat, because a lot of the labor to get in there to the transfer case shifter is already being done by removing this. So we're going to do that also. Now let me show you the parts that I bought for this job. Here's the 4 shifter bushings that I bought from Toyota. They're all the same bushing, and here's the part number right here. For the transfer case shifter seat, I plan on removing the top plate on the top of the transfer case, and there's a paper gasket that you need to replace. And here's the part number. Now you might be mistaken and think that this is the only gasket you need when you take off that top plate, but there's actually another thing that is suggested to replace, and that's an oil deflector. So this oil deflector is metal, but on the opposite side, it has a paper gasket that's basically glued to it. So it's kind of 2 pieces in one. And here's the part number for that. So when it comes to a replacement shifter seat, Toyota only offers the whole plate assembly, which you'll see when it gets to the time where I'm taking that top plate off of the top of the transfer case. You have to buy the whole assembly because they don't sell the shifter seat separately. In order to save money, Marlin Crawler makes an aftermarket shifter seat that we're going to install instead of replacing the whole top plate. That's all the parts that we bought for this job. Here's some of the prices we paid. This is the price that I paid for the bushing and the gasket. As you can see, I get a little bit of a discount because the people at my local Toyota dealer like me. Here's the price I paid for the deflector. And here's the price for the shifter seat for Marlin Crawler. I bought 2 of them just to have a backup one. The other 2 parts that you might want to consider getting, or you find out the hard way that you need them, is these boots. This is basically all torn to shreds, but this is the boot that goes around the transfer case shifter. So if you found that this was torn and you wanted to replace it during this job, you can replace this. And the other boot you can replace doing this job is this boot that goes around the shifter lever. Hopefully when you take yours apart, you're going to find that they're still intact. You don't have to spend money on it. But once you get it all torn down and you realize that these boots are torn and you want to replace them, we'll provide a link in the video description to these boots. I learned the part number through a guy that frequents toyota4runner.org. His handle is Sleepy Dad. His real name is Andy. He was nice enough to do a little write-up and video on how he did this job, which included replacing these two boots. All right, with all that said, let's get out to the truck and start doing this job. We're on the driver's side of the vehicle, and I'm going right underneath the driver door. The automatic shifter linkage is up behind this plastic cover. You can get in there and loosen the little 12mm nut to disconnect the linkage, but in order to better show you where I'm going without this thing in the way, I'm going to remove it. It's held on by 3 12mm bolts and 1 clip. So one of the bolts is right here in the rear near this cross member. Another one is right here. You have a tab right here that you have to clear of the frame, and then the furthest most forward on the driver's side frame rail is another 12mm bolt, and then we'll be able to remove this plastic cover out of our way. So to remove these 12mm bolts, I'm just going to zip them out with my Milwaukee cordless ratchet, short extension with a 12mm socket. I'm going to support this with my one hand, and I'm going to get underneath this clip and pry it out. Okay, the clip is free. I'm still supporting it with one hand, and I'm going to get the last one out so I don't put a lot of strain on the plastic. So now I could just drop this down. So this is the connection we're going to break free. Up above you have the shifter lever, and it comes down and meets up with the shifter linkage for the automatic transmission. It has a long slot with adjustability, so in order to get it back to where it was originally, I'm going to use a paint marker and mark the area of the washer where it meets up, so I know that I'll be able to get it back in the same position. You can do this with a Sharpie, whatever you have. So now with the 3/8 ratchet and a 12mm socket, I'm going to break this connection free. It's only torqued to 9 foot-pounds, so it shouldn't be that tight. So you have the nut and the washer, and then you could just move this out of the way and it'll flop down. And then just so I don't misplace this, I'm just going to slide this right back on to the shifter lever. The rig we're working on is Sean's 98 4runner. The 3rd gen 4runner years have some differences when it comes to the center console and the type of transfer case shifter. If you have a 96 to 98, you're going to have some electrical switches in this console that goes around the parking brake. You're going to have the ECT button, you're going to have the rear window control, you're going to have the little speaker and light for the alarm system. When you lift this up, you're going to have to disconnect those electrical connectors. What Sean did on this rig is, this is the rig he shot the cup holder mod. So what he did is he took a cup holder out of a 99 to 2002 and swapped it out and did all the necessary modifications to make it work. So if you did have one of those models, you just have to know that as soon as you pry this up, you have to get behind and disconnect those electrical connectors so you can get this free. And if you want to see how that's done, you can click on the link above and you can see the video where I installed a transmission temperature gauge on my 98 4runner, and I had to disconnect those electrical connectors to get this piece off. When it comes to the transfer case shifter, it depends whether or not you have a base model or SR5 or a limited model. The SR5 and base models will have a J-shift transfer case shifter to where the knob spins off lefty-loosey, so you just grab it and spin it and you can remove it from the top of the lever. With the limited models, it's held on with a JIS screw, Japanese Industrial Standard screw. So you have to remove a screw that faces the driver's side, and then you can get the knob free of the shifter lever. So those are the differences you might see depending on the model you have. So the first thing we're going to remove is this parking brake center console piece. So to do that, you lift up the hatch for your center console, and then you have to start pulling on this forward towards the dashboard to break it free. Now, if you don't have a plastic tool like this, you literally could pull on this with your hands and most likely get it free, but I'm going to utilize this tool. So I'm going to get it underneath there and pry forward a little bit, and after you get it moving forward a little bit, then it's a matter of prying up, and then you can free this just like so. So since this is a limited model, I'm going to now have to get my JIS screwdriver and remove the screw on this side so I could then pull off this trim piece. So here's the screw I'm talking about right here. And the reason why I'm using a JIS screwdriver rather than a Phillips is Japanese automobiles are made with a little bit of a different head screw, and a Japanese industrial standard screwdriver will fit the heads better and there will be less chance that you'll strip it out. Just know that from the factory they put a little bit of Loctite on this screw, so you'll find that it's going to be pretty hard to remove if you have a limited model. So make sure you got a good bite on the head of the screw and don't strip it out. Sean has already removed this, so that's why it's a lot easier to remove. He's already broken free this Loctite. All right, so that's removed. Now we can pull up this plastic trim piece around the shifters. So in order to get this trim piece off, you just get your hands underneath and you pull up. With the shifter in the park position, you might find it a little bit difficult to get it off. And if you wanted to make it a little easier, you can remove a little hatch off of this area right here to expose this plastic tab. So here's the tab I'm talking about. You just get a little flat blade screwdriver in there, you pop it out, and you can expose that little plastic tab you can manipulate to get it out of park. And if you just get a flat blade screwdriver and move this plastic tab back towards the rear of the vehicle, then you can shift it and you can get it more centered if you wanted to do that. This is a mechanism that sometimes tow truck drivers use when they don't have the keys of the vehicle. They can take the little plastic cover off and then manipulate this little tab to where they can shift it. Without the plastic tab push, you can see I can't get it out of park. So that's what that mechanism is for. So I am gonna manipulate this little switch to where I can get the shifter a little bit more centered so I can pull off the center console easier. So pull back, move it to about neutral. So now I'm just going to get my fingers right underneath here and pull up, and you can remove the shifter. You're going to have an electrical connector for this push button shifter. This is usually going to be a lot tighter, but because Sean unbundled the wires that led to all the switches on the parking brake center console piece, this has a lot more room to stretch. Usually you can't pick it up this high, but this is good because this is gonna be easier to show you the electrical connector you have to disconnect. You might find, like I've also found, that this connector is kind of a pain in the butt to disconnect. And the best way that I've found to get this thing disconnected is not to attack it from this side, but I get underneath this opening with a small screwdriver. It's basically a mini screwdriver like you would use for eyeglasses. You get it underneath there, you can hook the little tab and then pry down and backwards, and you should be able to get it free. So don't be surprised if this fights you, but if you use that technique of getting the screwdriver in the opening and then prying down and backwards, you should be able to get it free. Now this shifter console is out of the way. The next thing we're going to remove is this trim piece on either side of the center console. You have a JIS screw here, and then you have a little plastic plug right here. So I'm going to get this screw out first. For these style clips, it's a push button. You push it and it breaks. That wasn't supposed to happen, but we'll show you hopefully on the other side that this actually works like it's supposed to. So let's go to the other side. So we were on the passenger side, now we're on the driver's side. Let's see if this clip is in better shape. I'm going to push it with this little spudger tool. We'll put a link in the video description to these nice tools that are great and handy for a lot of jobs. I'm going to push it in, it's going to pop, and then you can get a screwdriver behind it and pry it out. So this is what it looks like. You can see that when the pin goes through, it flares out these little fins, and that's how it locks in place. So to get it back in, all you would do is compress the little fins, push it back in, and then you push the center plug and it locks it in place. So for this trim piece, once you remove the screw and the tab, you can slide it towards the floorboard to disconnect it. There's two plastic clips that hold it into the center console. So I'm just going to get my hands in here and push straight down and back, and you can see that these two tabs right here fit into these slots right here and right here. So that's where I was breaking those tabs free. and I'm going to do the same with the other side. So now we're at the point that we can remove the shifter assembly. You have a total of 8 bolts that are holding the shifter assembly to the body. Starting from the front, on the driver's side of the shifter lever, you got one in the front here, right underneath the center console. Going back, you have one here, one right here, and then you have another one right here. And then on the passenger side of the shifter, you have another bolt here, you have one right there, you have another one here, and then going all the way forward on the passenger side, you got another one right there. They're all 10mm bolts, and I'm gonna zip them out mostly with my Milwaukee ratchet. So in regards to sloppy shifter bushings, this is an example of what we're talking about. See all this movement? This has just gross movement, and I could see that the bushing has deteriorated. So that's the cause of all that massive play. So this is what we're going to be fixing by replacing the shifter bushings. So to speed up the process of removing all the 8 bolts that hold the shifter to the body, I'm going to utilize the Milwaukee ratchet. I got a medium 3/8 extension, a shorter one, or you could just use one longer one. And then I got a 10mm socket, and I'm going to start zipping these out. So that's the 3 easiest ones to get on the driver's side. I'm going to go for the 3 easiest on the passenger side. Now I'm going to go for the 2 in the front that are the hardest to get to. I'll see if I can still zip them out with my Milwaukee with a shorter extension. So now I have a really short extension, about as short as you can get, about 2 inches. And this is still going to enable me to use the Milwaukee to get those front bolts out. And then the one on the front right. One thing that I'd like to show you of how the mechanism works that stops you from being able to shift out of park unless you have your foot on the brake. The mechanism is right in here. It's a little solenoid. And so I'm going to have my girlfriend push the brake lever, and you're going to see that little thing move to where you can shift it out of park. Go ahead. So right there. So you see that? Now I'm going to have her take her foot off the brake, and then I'm going to manipulate the little lever and pull it backwards, and you're going to see it's going to do the same thing. See how I'm able to move it? So that's what you're defeating when you either push the brake pedal to operate the little solenoid in there, or when you manually pull the tab to pull this thing back to where you can shift it out of park, say if you wanted to tow it. With all 8 bolts out, we still have to disconnect this one electrical connector in the back under the center console to where we can remove it. So you push on this button right here. It's a button that's facing towards the driver's side. I push on it, pull back, and then now that's free. And before you start pulling on anything, you just want to look to see that you're not going to be hooking any wires when you pull this up. There is another thing that you could remove to make it a little bit easier to clear the shifter assembly from this part of the center console with your little cargo area here. Sean shows that in the cup holder mod video that he did. So if you click on the link above, you can see how we did that if you didn't want to just fight a little bit here to get it free. I'm choosing not to remove this center console because I don't want to mess with it. I know that if I just manipulate this plastic and pull it out of the way enough, I can get the shifter assembly free. So entirely optional. So I'm gonna just pull up on the shifter, and then I'm gonna pry on this plastic piece and get it free here, and then work it out right there. So now you can see I got it free. Don't want to capture that wire. This shifter boot around the transfer case shifter sticks on there pretty well. So basically, you know when you sometimes take off a pair of socks and it goes inside out? That's what I recommend you do. You just keep pulling it up. It's going to pull the boot inside out, and it's going to free the boot of the shifter. And don't hit yourself in the face. There we go. And like I said, we basically turned the prophylactic rubber inside out. So with the transfer case shifter boot inside out, I'm just going to push it back in here and get it looking correct again. you can just get this out of your way. You might fight this like I'm fighting it a little bit, but I'll get it. I think I'm going to use a handle of my 1/2" drive ratchet, see if I can get it. There we go, that worked. So you just want to be a little bit gentle with this. You don't want to be cranking on it too hard because you don't want to rip it, because as you can see, Sean's boots are intact. So just be a little bit gentle when you're prying on it so you don't rip it and force yourself to have to replace it. I've got the shifter on my bench vise. I have the arm of the shifter lever captured in the vise right here. The next thing that I'm going to release is this part of the shifter lever right here. So it's held on by 3 JIS screws. There's one right here, there's one in the back right here, there's one right here. So I'm going to use my JIS screwdriver and remove all 3 of those. Now you can see that I can move this thing pretty freely. It's still held with some wires, but it's going to get out of my way enough for the next step. We're going to be going for the bushing replacement right here, and so to get this bolt out, we have to remove this nut right here, but then when you go to the other side, we have this plastic piece that's in the way. In order to get the bolt slid out, we have to release 3 screws. You could see them right here, 1, 2, and 3, and then we can manipulate it a little bit forward and up to where we can get the bolt out, which is right underneath here. Now, when you're working on something for the very first time, you want to take your time and pay attention to how things fit together. So looking at how this mechanism works, see how when I operate the push button, it's moving this whole assembly? There's a little metal nub in here as part of this metal shifter assembly that's capturing this opening. So just remember that when you're getting it back together, that you have to make sure that this little tab right here fits into this slot. So when you push the button, it will operate it. So now I'll be able to pry this thing away and tilt it up enough to where I can expose the bolt head to where we can slide it out. Now it's time to break free this nut so we can remove the bolt and get at the bushings. This happens to be a 13 millimeter. Kind of odd because you don't see too many 13 millimeter nuts and bolts on these vehicles. So I'm just using my gear wrench ratchet, short extension with a 13 millimeter socket, and I'm going to break this free. I was able to break it free without holding the other side, but if you find that the whole thing is turning on you, you might have to get on the bolt head on this right side to where it's not spinning. You can break this free. So I'll remove this nut, and then let's see if I could just start pushing this out. Yep, I could start pushing it out. So you saw how I was pushing with my finger on the other side. I'm going to move this plastic doohickey out of the way and start feeding it through, and then grab a hold of it with my hand and slide it all the way out. Like so. So here's the big long bolt that goes through that shifter lever. So now with the bolt out, I can just rotate this forward, and I'm going to expose this side of the shifter shaft right here. I don't know if it's going to really show in the video, but basically Sean's shifter has no bushing left. There's just little granules. The bushing pretty much 100% disintegrated. There was no bushing left. I'll show you what the other side looks like. Here's the opposite side, and like I said, I don't know if you could see it, but there's just basically some little remnants of the blue or turquoise bushing. There's basically nothing left here. So all I'm going to do is just get in here and clean up some of this little debris here, and then insert the new bushings. So to clean up the inside of the shifter rod, I'm going to use some isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips, and I'm just going to get in there and clean out all that debris. And you could see the goop that is coming out. That's just basically disintegrated bushing. So I'm just going to keep on doing this and clean it up really good. When it comes to instructions for dealing with this shifter, The factory service manual only really gives you instructions on how to remove it, but not anything on how to work on it like we're doing, replacing these bushings. There's nothing I can consult that says, hey, you should lubricate these bushings or not lubricate them. I'm going to choose to lubricate them, and what I'm going to use is this Mission automotive paste that I've used for polyurethane bushings in some of the videos we've made. Since it works well with poly bushings, I figure it will work well with these plastic bushings. So here's what the bushing looks like. It's got this lip right here that obviously goes towards the outside, and this side slides into the rod of the shifter. So I'm going to lubricate this surface. And then I'm going to slide it into the shaft of the shifter. I'm also going to put a little bit on the inside where the bolt will be sliding against. So now I'm going to spin the shifter around and I'm going to get the bushing in on the opposite side. On this side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the shifter to where I can look right in this area between this bracket, and I could slide it in. Just like that. And just like the other side, I'm going to put a little bit on the inside of the diameter. So now that both bushings are in, I'm going to make sure that the bushing doesn't get hung up when I get it slid in place, and this rod is going to line up with the tabs on either side. So you're going to have to get on both sides of this. Make sure the bushing's going in. The shifter rod is now between both tabs, and then I'm going to come in from this side and slide the bolt through. So again, you have to pull this plastic piece out of your way, at the same time making sure that the shifter shaft is lined up with the tab. So it might be a little bit tricky. Okay, it's sliding through. It's hanging up on the other side, so I have to turn it and see what's going on there. So it's not lined up perfectly on that side. Get it lined up and push it all the way through. Bring this rod up a little bit, push on the other side. And there we go, it's through. Now I can get the nut on. I'll just spin this on. Now, since the factory service manual doesn't say anything about how to disconnect this, I don't have a torque spec for this. This thing doesn't have to be gorilla tight, so I'm just going to get my little shorty 3/8 ratchet, tighten it up by feel, and call it good. I've got my finger on the other side, and I could tell that the bolt head isn't moving, so I didn't have to hold it to get this tight. Okay, and I'm going to call that good. So see this little nub right here? When I push the button on the shifter, it moves. That little nub needs to go right in here, like I said earlier. We're ready to get this back in place. Just make sure that that little metal nub goes right in there. Should you lubricate it? I guess I will. I'm going to put a little bit of silicone paste in here so this thing slides a little easier. So I'm just going to put some in there and then put this down, and just like I said, make sure that the little metal nub captures in this little U-shaped piece of this white plastic piece. So now I'm going to get the 3 screws back in. Okay, those are all cinched up. Now we're going to get this back down and affixed to the shifter, this plastic piece here. What you want to make sure when you're getting this piece back in place, remember this little tab that we showed that moves this lever. This lever needs to go underneath this other white plastic piece. I have my little spudger tool on it and I'm moving it forward. So you want to get that plastic arm underneath the other arm to where when you manipulate this little plastic tab, you will actuate this to where you can get it out of park if you need to. So just be aware of that the little lever has to go underneath the other one. So now I'm going to get the 3 JIS screws that hold this to the shifter lever in place. So like I said, the other 2 bushings live right underneath this boot. Now, depending on your preference, you can get in here with a slim tool like the spudger tool or a screwdriver, and you could pry this back and you can expose the nut on this side, and then you could pull the boot back and expose the bolt head on the other side. And guys are able to successfully do it like this. What I'm going to choose to do is I'm just going to remove this boot altogether to make it easier to work. So right here, this is how the boot affixes to the shifter plate. There's a little metal sleeve, and you could just push this out. It's barely held in there. Just push it out with whatever tool you have, a flat blade screwdriver, and force it out one way. And so this is what the little thing looks like. Once you get that out, being careful, you can pry on the boot and get this part of the boot out of this hole. So you might want to use like a little spudger tool or screwdriver, being careful not to rip it, and you pull back and you could free it. So you could see it starting to make its way out, and boom, it's free. And so I'm going to do that on all 4 corners to where I can remove the boot. Now that I have all 4 tabs of this boot free, I can just slide it down the shaft. And now you can see the bolt that we need to remove. This one is also a 13 millimeter. So I'm going to break it free with my little shorty gear wrench ratchet. Then I'm going to push the bolt through. And this is what the bolt looks like. Now you can see this thing's flopping quite a bit, but there's one other thing I can disconnect, and that's the linkage up above here that I'll show you. I'm going to take a little clip out to where I can have an easier time getting these bushings in. In the next section, you're going to see me remove a couple little C-clips so I can free the arm completely to remove the second set of bushings. And you know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Looking at the footage, it looks like you can get those bushings out no problem without removing that other little arm. But when I was in the middle of the job, it did look like the little tabs that the bushings fit between were going to hinder removing the bushing. So I followed the lead of some other guys that have done this job and removed that little intermediate arm to get the arm completely free for the bushing replacement. So fair warning, try to get the bushings out and back in without removing those clips and remove that other arm, because I think you can do it no problem. I just needed to pull on the arm just a little bit more, and I know I would have found that I would have been able to get the old bushings out and the new bushings in. So you have that option. If you want to still remove that little arm and get in there and clean and do some lubricating, then that's entirely your choice, but I don't think it's necessary. So here's the connection I'm talking about. It's held on with a little C-clip right here. So I'm going to get this in my vise to hold it steady, and then I'm going to disconnect the C-clip to where I can disconnect the rest of the shifter linkage from here. So what I did is I got the opening of the C-clip. You can feel with the screwdriver, and if you clean this up a bit, you can see better what you're doing. And the C-clip has these little openings where you can get a small screwdriver in there. So I just have a tiny little flat blade screwdriver. I'm getting it in one of those little slots. I'm twisting backwards and getting some real estate, and then I could slide it back all the way. And I got the clip out, and now I can free the arm of this other little intermediate arm. You have a little washer here, and then I could slide the arm out. I thought I would be able to sneak it out by just removing one side of this arm, but it looks like I can't tweak it enough, so I'm gonna have to go for the other C-clip. The other C-clip is right here. I'm gonna do the same technique with the little screwdriver and remove the clip. Got it out. Remove the washer. Now that both C-clips are out, I should be able to take a little bit of weight with my left hand off the shifter and work this thing off, just like that. So now I have this whole lever free, and the bushings are right here and right here. You'll notice that there's another plastic washer on both sides, on the arm and then right in here. So make sure when you're putting it back together that you have a washer on both sides of this little arm here. Now, in comparison with the other bushings we just replaced and these are pretty well intact. I can see that they're not disintegrated. So for whatever reason, the shifter bushings that I replaced first are the ones that are more likely to wear out, or at least it appears to be the case. So I'm gonna get these out and get some new ones in here. I'm just gonna get a little flat blade screwdriver in there and pry out and pull this sucker out. Yeah, it's pretty well still intact. This thing is in pretty good shape, but we're gonna replace them anyway since we're in here. So again, I'm gonna get in here with the screwdriver in between the bushing and the sleeve and get it out. This one actually broke apart a little bit, so this side was a little bit worse off. Yep, so that one was a little bit more brittle. Same procedure. I'm going to clean up the inside a little bit with a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol, and then I'm going to lubricate the bushings and get them inserted. Okay, I've got new bushings installed on both sides. I lubricated them just like I lubricated the other ones. And because this thing pivots also while you're shifting, I think I'm going to put a little bit of silicone paste on both sides of this so the shifting linkage just moves nice and smooth. Okay, you get the idea. I'm going to lubricate the other sides and the plastic washers and then get ready to put the shifter arm back on. So I'm going to come in through the back side of the plate with the arm. I'm going to grab this section of the linkage. I'm going to slide it over the arm side first, and then I'm going to get it over the bottom side. Okay, and again, I made sure that I had washers on both sides on the inside, and then now I have to get the other washer and the clip in place. So the top washer here, and then the bottom washer. So getting this clip in place, you want to make sure you're careful and don't drop it. Just be really cautious, hang on to it. Okay, fair warning, these little C-clips that hold this arm on are a little bit difficult to get back in place. I tried with the needle nose pliers, but it wasn't working that well. And then I just got the clip started and I used a flat blade screwdriver to push it in place. But I think there's a high chance you can drop the clip and lose it wherever you're working on this shifter. So just be really careful that you don't drop that clip, and so you don't have to go to Toyota and see if you can pick up another one, which might be difficult. Now that we have the linkage hooked back up, we're going to slide the shifter in place between the two sleeves here. Bolt from this direction, line up the other side, and slide it through. Now we just got to get our nut on, and then we'll cinch this one up with my little shorty ratchet. We'll see if this bolt head starts turning. Nope, it's staying still. It's going to cinch this up. It's actually turning a little bit now. I will have to hold it. This doesn't make too much sense to me, but what fits this bolt head is a 9/16. It's not metric. I tried a 14 millimeter and it wouldn't fit. I tried a 15 millimeter and it was way too big. So I'm using a 9/16 open end wrench. Okay, that's nice and tight. Now that this bolt is tight, I'm going to get the boot back in place, and it's just a matter of fitting these little grommets in through to where it seats in the little groove right here. You just push it in, manipulate it. It's pretty pliable. One of these spudger tools might help, or something similar. Just get it hooked in there as best you can. Start pushing and you'll get it. And there you go. You see I have one of them in, and I'm going to get the other three in as well, and then push the little metal sleeves in place. Okay, I've got the boot back on fully with the little metal sleeves, and this part of the job is done. So now we're going to go back into the truck. We're going to remove the top plate off the transfer case so we can remove the old shifter seat and replace it with one from Marlin Crawler. So here's the transfer case shifter. You got this boot, and then you got this plate that the shifter sits into. Over to the right here, there is a breather hose that connects right here. We're going to have to disconnect that before we can get this plate up. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up this boot and get the shifter out of the plate. So what I'm going to utilize to get the boot up is I'm going to utilize this little pick tool that I have. I'm going to get underneath the boot and lift up and separate it from the top plate. You'll see that it exposes this area here. There's a clip right here that you can squeeze with maybe a snap ring pliers or a needle nose pliers. You bring it inboard and you can free the clip of this part of the top plate, and then we can pull the shifter out. So I'm going to try the needle nose pliers method, see if this works. Okay, I got on there, got a good bite. Push on it from the side and get it a little more out of there. There we go. And you can see now that this clip came off. As soon as I took the clip off, this thing is under spring pressure. This popped up, and then I should be able just to pull this thing right out. So you got all these little pieces here, and then it sits into a couple grooves. So if I pull up just like that, and you can see that this has a little bushing right here. I'm going to be careful not to drop these pieces into the transfer case, but right here the shifter seat came out. It's coming out in pieces. What I'm going to do is bring this over to the workbench so I can show you a little bit better, and so I'm not working right over the top of the transfer case. So you can see that the shifter seat is right here, and it's just brittle, and it's like going to break right off of this shifter. See how the pieces are just falling off? The other times that we've done this, this didn't happen. The shifter seat stayed inside the little top plate, but this time it was actually kind of glued on here. So I think I'm probably going to have to grab some steel wool and get the rest of this stuff scraped off, get it all cleaned up nice. So now let's go back into the truck and we're going to get that top plate off. So now I'm going to go after disconnecting the little breather line that connects up to the top plate. This breather line basically just does a U, like a horseshoe shape, and goes to the void in between the transmission and the transfer case. So I'm going to utilize a little pick tool again and see if I can get underneath there and help separate it. You know, I take that back. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to first remove this and then see if I can have an easier time getting the breather hose free, because it's just a little hard to get in there with my pick tool. So I'm going to take these 12mm bolts out first. So I'm utilizing my gear wrench, 3/8 ratchet, a medium length extension, and a 12mm socket. And these aren't on there that tight. The torque spec's pretty low, so they should come off pretty easily. Transition to my Milwaukee to speed up the process. Now you can see I was able just to pull that up pretty easily. So now that I can manipulate the top plate, I can hopefully get the little pick tool in there easier to break free the breather. I'm going to try to grab onto the breather hose with my little spark plug wire pullers and see if I could turn the hose a little bit and break it free. There we go. Finally got it free. You could see the little nipple that the breather line was on. So now let's get over to the bench and I'll show you better some of the remnants of the shifter seat. Looking in here, you can see what's left of the shifter seat. I'm just going to pry it out with this little spudger tool. And so you can see how the shifter seat just gets mangled over time. It's just in pieces. So that's why we're replacing it. Another part of the shifter seat assembly is this little rubber gasket. Doing a little test fit, it looks like with the Marlin Crawler shifter seat, you can keep this rubber gasket in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this up really good, and then we're going to get the shifter seat inside here. So I got it cleaned up pretty good in there. I'm going to put this rubber gasket down on the bottom again, and then you'll notice how this thing is shaped. It's got two little indentations on opposing sides, and that's to help get it in place over these little studs on the top plate. What you can do is you just put it over the top with the indentations on the studs. You rotate it, and then it might get hooked on this rubber gasket a little bit, but if you are careful and you push down with your finger, you can get it in, and it sits just like that. Here's one of the gaskets that we're going to replace. So this one is pretty much stuck on here. It's got this little tab, and I could get it started a little bit pulling this thing off and work it off. I got a little separation. Grab this little plastic tool, work it underneath there. There we go. Getting it free a little bit here. I'm going to keep on using this little spudger tool and get it off. So that came off nice and clean, pretty easy. And you can see how it's shaped. You really only could get the gasket on one way. You couldn't mix it up because of the way these tabs are. So on my part search, I did good on getting the right gasket for this application. We're now going to go into the rig, and I'm going to show you what the oil deflector looks like on the transfer case on Sean's rig. And where the mistake I think I made was I followed somebody else's lead, and they had a J shifter model and not the push button model for the transfer case. So this deflector that I got isn't the right one, and I just called Toyota, and Toyota doesn't have any anywhere in my area. The closest one is Mesa, Arizona. So for me to be able to get Sean's truck back together, I'm going to have to utilize the old deflector. So let's go into the truck and I'll show you what that deflector looks like. So at first inspection, you might think that this plate is just part of the transfer case housing, but it's not. If you get your finger in here and pull up, it'll be stuck on a little bit. This is what the deflector looks like on the push button model in comparison to the J shifter model. And it's kind of common sense to notice the difference because the J shifter has to move a lot more than this one. The push button one just has to move front and back. The J shifter one has to go down and over and then up. And that's why they make two distinctly different oil deflectors. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to put this old one back in because I have no choice. I can't get one anytime soon. It's gonna take days to get here. It's gonna be up to Sean if he's gonna go back in here and replace this and have to remove all the same crap. It pays to do your research, and I messed up. Okay, so ideally, the first thing you put down is your new deflector, if you got the right one. You put that down with the paper gasket side facing the transfer case. Then next, you're gonna get your other paper gasket, and you'll notice that this little nub is gonna face towards the back of the rig. Put that down. I have read that some guys put a little bit of gear oil on it to where it will stick in place, but I'm not gonna bother doing that. Next, I'm gonna get the breather line, slide it on, and then I'm gonna set it down on top of the transfer case. I'm gonna get one of my bolts, and hopefully everything's gonna be lined up, which it's not right now. That's looking better. Okay, that one started. This one started. Okay, they're all started. Now I'm just gonna get them all snug down first and then break out my torque wrench. All right, so I've got them all cinched down with my little shorty ratchet, and now I'm going to torque them to spec. The spec is 13 foot-pounds. I'm choosing to use my inch-pound torque wrench, and when you want to make a conversion from foot-pounds to inch-pounds, you just multiply by 12. So 13 times 12 is 156. So I just have my little short CDI torque wrench. And just like anytime you're tightening down multiple bolts, I'm going to go in a crossing pattern and slowly bring them up to the spec. There it is, there it is, there it is, and there it is. So they're all now torqued to 13 foot-pounds or 156 inch-pounds. One thing that you could replace also is this little nylon bushing that goes on the end of the shifter arm that interfaces with the transfer case shifting linkage. Normally these don't get mangled and go bad, but it's an optional piece you can replace, and I'll put a link in the video description of this little bushing if you would like to replace it also at the same time. So if you look down in there, you can see the hole that the bushing goes into. So you just have to find the hole and then slide the shifter over these pins, and then you'll have to get the clip in place. So obviously the shifter has a little dog leg, and the dog leg goes towards the driver, not towards the passenger side, because then it would get in the way of the automatic transmission shifter. So fit it down in there, line up the studs, and there we go. It's sat all the way in. So it appears I was mistaken. I don't think you can utilize this OEM rubber washer underneath the Marlin Crawler shifter seat, because as I was trying to get this clip in place, I could not get it to save my life. So what I think is happening is this thing is keeping the assembly too high to where this clip can get in place in the groove. So now I removed it. I got the shifter seat back in there without this rubber gasket, and now I'm going to try to get it in again. So I'm going to slide it down in there, line up the pins. Okay, that's down in there. Spring, other little plate, and then the top plate. I'm going to get the clip over, I'm going to push down on the spring, and I'm going to try to get one side hooked, the side closest to me. So once you have one side hooked, and ideally you start with the tabs kind of centered between two of these little pieces right here, to where in the future if you want to get it out, you can easily get on there with a snap ring pliers or needle nose pliers. And then I got it hooked on this driver's side of the shifter plate. Then I got the clip and I got it pushed down, but it wasn't in all the way. And then I grabbed my flat blade screwdriver, I pushed down in a couple spots, and I was able to get it to go into the groove on this side, also these two tabs. So now the shifter is all the way affixed properly to the top plate. I'm just gonna roll the boot down and get the boot back over the top of the plate. Okay, and you could just fit it over there. It just kind of finds its proper seat. I can tell that it's not easy to lift up, so it's right in the position it needs to be. So now we're going to get the shifter assembly back in on the body. You're going to have to get it over this boot first, kind of turn it sideways like this, get it started, rotate it to where the shifter is going to be going to the left side of the transmission and transfer case. Rotate it in place. Make sure you're not capturing any wires underneath this shifter plate. We got to get it past this plastic here. Don't want to bend it too much. Okay, it's down past the plastic. Again, I'm going to double check and make sure I'm not capturing any wires like this one right here, and I'm not capturing the carpet. Okay, it looks good. I'm gonna get my electrical connector reconnected in the back here. Snaps in place. And now I'm gonna get all my bolts started. And you get the idea. I'm just gonna get all 8 bolts started. So now I'm gonna torque the 8 shifter assembly bolts to 52 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. If you didn't have a torque wrench, this is not a real imperative thing, so you can get away with just using the old German spec of good and tight. But since I have a torque wrench, I'm gonna torque them. I'm gonna crisscross and just bring them up slowly. But this isn't like tightening a head on an engine. It doesn't matter if you don't get it perfectly right because it's not a gasket sealing anything. But I'm still gonna kind of crisscross and tighten them down slowly and evenly. And you get the idea. I'm just gonna torque them all to spec. I just checked with my little shorty ratchet. This has basically very little mechanical advantage. I don't like the 52-inch torque spec. It's a little light for my taste, so I'm just going to go a little bit tighter with this short ratchet. Not much more, just like maybe a quarter turn, half turn at the most. I'm going to get these little side trim pieces back in place. So again, you hook them into the holes and then you slide towards the back of the rig and lock them in place. Make sure that you can get this on the inside, so do that first and then slide it in place. So it's a little tricky to get this piece back in place. You have to get it hooked on the front, and then you want to make sure it's on the inside of this, pull forward, and then now the piece is in place. And I'm going to do the same with the driver's side. The rest of it is pretty straightforward. The first thing I did is I got these side plates back in, and what you have to make sure is that the plate goes on the inside of this piece right here, so it fits behind there, and then you get your screw in place. With this side, you have to make sure that you get the 2 plastic hooks in the slot, and then you pull it back towards the rear of the vehicle and it snaps in place. And then you have that little clip right there that you got to get back in and put the little centerpiece in to lock it in place. Next, I put the plastic trim piece over the automatic transmission and the transfer case. And I made sure that I connected the electrical connector for the push button 4-wheel drive setup on this limited model. And then I lined up the screw hole and I got the screw back in place tight with my JIS screwdriver, and then I made sure that it snapped fully back down onto the center console. This parking brake trim piece is again easy. You just slide it over, snap it in place. If you happen to have a 96 through 98 with the electrical connectors for the ECT for the transmission, the rear window, and the light and the little speaker for the alarm system, you plug all those connectors back together and then you snap it in place. Pretty simple. Now you remember what the shifter was like before we put the new bushings in. It had a lot of side-to-side play. Now when I move this, it's tight, no movement whatsoever, so the job was successful. After I got the trim pieces back in place, I went under the truck, I hooked up the shift lever connection to the automatic transmission shifter linkage. I used the marks that I made as a guide to where I needed to get the nut and washer tightened down to the linkage. The torque spec, if you want a torque spec for that, is 9 foot-pounds. I torqued the nut to 9 foot-pounds and found that it seemed a little bit light, so I gave it about another 1/8 of a turn with my 3/8 ratchet and called it good. Next, if you remove that plastic guard underneath there that kind of protects the area of the fuel filter and that area on the driver's side. Get that back in with the 3 12mm bolts and the plastic clip. Tighten it to wherever you think is good. It doesn't really need to be torqued to spec. Just get it tight to where the thing isn't going to fall off the rig while you're driving. Now let's start it up and make sure it goes into all the gears. I put my foot on the brake. Okay, that's working. It's releasing. Goes into neutral. Felt like it dropped into drive. Second and low. Now, if you have the linkage correct, you should be able to bump it back up and it drops into each gear. So it dropped into second. It dropped into drive. It dropped into neutral. But when you get to the point where you get to reverse, it doesn't let you do that as a safety mechanism. So you got to push the button, go into reverse, and from reverse you can't just bump it up into park, so you have to push the button again and go into park. So it appears to be working like it should. All right, we're all done with this job. And what did I learn? Well, number one, it pays to do a little bit more research. I knew that there was 2 different transfer cases, but what I didn't know is that the oil deflector would be different on those 2 different models. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the 2 different part numbers for the oil deflector for the 2 different styles of transfer cases that these rigs could come with in the video description, along with all the other part numbers and tools I used. Just know that the J shifter style transfer case has a different oil deflector than the push button style transfer case. The other thing I learned is that when you're working with those small little clips to get that little arm off so you can get the second set of bushings off, those little clips, if you aren't careful and you let it go, it's going to get lost, like happened to me. So luckily, Sean had brought over this other shifter assembly and I was able to borrow one of the C-clips off of this, because I dropped it and I looked and I looked and I looked and I couldn't find the frickin' thing. It ran away from me. Just be careful, because if you lose one and you aren't like Sean and had a spare one of these available, you're going to have to go to the hardware store or maybe Toyota and see if you can match up that C-clip. Grab the other one off and then try to match it up, which I'm sure you could. That C-clip looks pretty darn standard on a lot of applications. The other thing I learned, and I should have remembered from the clutch job, but on the bottom of that transfer case shifter seat is that little rubber seat that is part of the shifter seat. And when you use the Marlin Crawler replacement shifter seat, you can't have that rubber piece underneath there, because then the assembly is too high, and when you go to get your retaining clip back underneath the lip of the top plate, you can't get it in. It's too tall. So I learned the hard way, and I had to take the shifter seat back out, remove that little rubber piece, and then I was able to get that clip in place no problem. So again, learn from my mistake. Don't try to keep that rubber piece in there. Get rid of it and replace it completely with the blue shifter seat from Marlin Crawler. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean, and my special helper Allison. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. Sick mods and healthy mods. And I hope you learned something. I hope you now have a nice, tight, automatic transmission shifter. Peace out. Bye-bye. Take care.